Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, number 39, from mid-December 2024. Reverend Henry Winter Syle, deaf scholar, preacher, Episcopal saint. Welcome to the 39th episode of Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, an historic and active cemetery in Bala, Pennsylvania. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University, volunteer tour guide, and volunteer podcaster. I am recording this in early December of 2024. Laurel Hill West opened in 1869 across the river from its sister cemetery Laurel Hill East in Philadelphia. It's more than twice as big as Laurel Hill East. It has a totally different feel and a strikingly different population. Laurel Hill East is a Victorian cemetery associated with the Civil War. Laurel Hill West is an Edwardian cemetery associated with the Great War. Now, like Laurel Hill East, it is open 365 days a year, now from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. There's plenty of parking at the business office just off Belmont Avenue or at the conservatory and bell tower. If you enter from Belmont, follow the road past the second gate with the white line in the middle. Another possibility is to come in while you're walking the Kinwood Trail. This month's episode of Biographical Bytes from Bala, I'm going to tell you about the Reverend Henry Winter Syle, a scholar who was deafened after a bout of childhood scarlet fever. But this led him to a religious vocation with a special call to serve the deaf, and he became the first non-hearing American to be ordained in the Episcopalian ministry. Today he is recognized as a saint of the Episcopal Church. Reverend Syle is interred at Laurel Hill West. Here's his story. Does language require a voice? What language runs through the minds of people who are born deaf and have never heard a human voice or a word in their lives? Throughout history, the deaf have been at both ends of the spectrum. Respected and revered by the Egyptians, but in Greece they were reviled, they were thought a burden to society, and they were put to death. And even then, deaf people without voices were noted to communicate. In the 4th century BCE, Plato quotes his teacher Socrates, "If we had neither voice nor tongue, and yet wished to manifest things to one another, should we not, like those which are at present mute, endeavor to signify our meaning by the hands, head, and other parts of the body?" A century later, Aristotle and physician Galen concluded that the deaf could never speak and therefore could not communicate. This view went unchallenged into the 16th century. Christianity took notice. Since the non-speaking could not ask for forgiveness at confession, many clergy reasoned that deaf people should not receive the sacrament of communion and could not enter heaven. For millennia, deafness was considered a catastrophic occurrence that isolated the non-hearing as unreachable, unteachable, doomed to a life of solitary confinement. As the famed deaf-blind icon Helen Keller once said, Blindness cuts people off from things. Deafness cuts people off from people. Until the 1860s, deafness was most often described as an affliction that isolated the individual from the Christian community. Its tragedy was that deaf people lived beyond the reach of the gospel. In 1618, Roman Catholic Jesuit ministers in the New World had written to church officials at the Vatican and asked whether a, quote, deaf-mute Indian, end quote, could be admitted to the church. They noticed that many non-hearing, non-vocalizing Native Americans still managed to communicate with others and with them by using their hands to form shapes and movements in the air. This was proof enough for the clerics that despite a lack of hearing and speaking, there was an intellect present, and therefore a soul. What's more, there were common signs among the Blackfoot, Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho, Sauk, Fox, Potawatomi, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Caddo. This allowed rudimentary communication that was not possible with words. This precursor to American Sign Language is called Plains Indian Sign Language. As late as 1749, the French Academy of Sciences appointed a commission to decide whether deaf people were capable of reasoning. Early attempts to educate the blind and deaf were usually made by tutors to the children of the wealthy. The honor for being the first person to educate the deaf out of purely humanitarian interests belongs to Charles Michel, Abbé de l'Épée. In 1760, in Paris, France, de l'Épée founded the Institution Nationale des Sourds-Muets, the National Institution for Deaf-Mutes, as the first public school in the world for the education of the deaf. Now, were there more deaf people 2 or 3 centuries ago than there are now? Of course there were. Many of the accepted causes of deafness, meningitis, scarlet fever, they've essentially been eliminated through vaccines and antibiotics. But then again, other so-called experts of that time blamed deafness on a fall into the water, seasickness, a thunderclap, fall onto a stove, getting salt in the ear, eating buckeyes, swallowing tobacco, teething, worms, lightning, scrofula, and cruelty. Probably the first documented attempt at tutoring a deaf child in the American colonies before the Revolutionary War is found in the diary of an indentured servant at the Belvedere Plantation in Virginia. These early attempts were followed by more formal attempts to give the deaf some skills that could be used in communication or to make a living. A common place for the deaf to work was in a print shop. Laurel Hill is the final resting place of one of the top lithographers of the 19th century, Albert Newsom, who trained at the Philadelphia Institute for the Deaf and Dumb. Over the past 2 centuries, we've seen the deaf move from being isolated and shunned to being full members of society. Many, if not most, deaf people do not consider their hearing problem to be a handicap. Deaf thought leaders think of their deaf culture as akin to ethnicity. Yet the deaf group is unlike any ethnic minority. For one thing, 90% of all deaf children are born to hearing parents. Many people never meet a deaf person in their lives unless one is born to them. And more than 70% of families with children who use sign language do not or cannot communicate with their children. For those of us with hearing, it's difficult to imagine what deafness from birth must feel like. We can close our eyes and put on a blindfold and stumble around in the dark and approach the world of blindness. But if we stuff cotton in our ears and wear headphones, that only makes us hard of hearing. It cannot let us feel what it must be like to have never heard words or formed a language internally or externally. Deaf children cannot grasp their parents' spoken language and hearing parents are unlikely to know sign language. Deafness forces us to see that communication is not a gift bestowed in infancy, but an acquisition gained only by laborious labor. And it forces us to acknowledge that not all languages involve speaking. Learning to speak is so hard for people who are deaf from infancy because they're trying without any direct feedback to mimic sounds they have never heard. And even if a deaf person does learn how to speak, understanding someone else's speech is maddening. Countless words look alike on the lips, even though they sound totally different. Mama and papa are indistinguishable. No new taxes and go to Texas look the same to a lip reader. Speaking of Texas, yes, there really is a county in the Panhandle named Deaf Smith County. It's named after a hero of the Battle of San Jacinto named Erastus Smith, who could not hear. Speech reading is also exhaustingly difficult, and even the best can only make out 3 or 4 words in every 10. It's no surprise that the deaf score poorly on tests of English skills. The average deaf 16-year-old reads at the level of a hearing 8-year-old. When deaf students eventually leave school, 3 in 4 are unable to read a newspaper. Only 2 deaf children in 100 go to college, compared with 40 out of 100 in the general population. Many deaf students write English as if it were a foreign language, which to them, of course, it is. The answer seems to be American Sign Language, or ASL. It's often called the national language of the deaf. Deaf children of deaf parents learn ASL as easily as hearing children learn spoken language from their speaking parents. At the same age that hearing babies start talking, deaf babies of people who sign begin babbling nonsense signs with their fingers. The late neurologist Oliver Sacks said that ASL is, quote, a language equally suitable for making love or speeches, for flirting or mathematics, end quote. ASL is the everyday language of about 500,000 Americans. I've seen it ranked as the 3rd most common language used at home after English and Spanish, but I've also seen it ranked a lot lower than that. I don't think we really know how many people use ASL. Blind men and blind women often take sighted spouses. 90% of deaf people who marry take a deaf spouse. When social scientists ask people who are blind or in wheelchairs, do you wish that you could see or walk? They instantly say yes. The deaf answer the equivalent question, no. The essence of deafness, they explain, is not the lack of hearing, but the community and culture based on ASL. Deaf culture stands not for denial, but as an affirmation. 2 schools of communication arose among the deaf and led to heated battles about what was best for them. But since the deaf were regarded as handicapped or somehow mentally deficient, they were not included in these discussions about what was best for them. What they got was the ableists' view of what was best for them. In the 1860s, oralism or lip reading and talking won out over manualism or sign language. Oralism is a combination of lip reading, speech mimicking, mouth shapes, breathing patterns, but it is associated with high class and high intellect because these people are speaking and they are understanding what somebody is saying. Oralists somehow managed to get manualism banned by the beginning of the 20th century. That was in schools. The deaf community continued to use it among themselves. Manualism was a product of the church. Evangelical romantic reform movements of the antebellum years. They emphasized moral regeneration and salvation. Reformers of this period usually trace social evils to the weakness of individuals. Their primary responsibility was to educate and convert. Opponents of manualism dared to ask the question, can God even understand sign language? Another advantage, manualism could be taught by deaf professors. Oralism was the product of a much-changed reform atmosphere after the Civil War, when emphasis shifted from reform of the individual through Christianity to the creation of national unity and social order through homogeneity of language and culture. In other words, the melting pot. Oralism could not be taught by non-speakers, so most deaf people could not serve as instructors. Both methods created images of deaf people as outsiders who depended on hearing people to rescue them from their exile. For manualists, the Christian community was the measure. For the oralists, it was an American nation defined in the secular terms of language and culture. Now, deaf people were thought to have a great moral advantage in that they had been left relatively unscathed by a corrupt world. They were innocent rather than living in darkness, and their deafness is an asylum rather than a prison. Hearing people experience silence as an absence of sound. For those who have never heard, silence is not an absence. The sign used today that is translated as hearing person is made next to the mouth, not the ear. It literally means speaking person. By the turn of the 20th century, nearly 40% of American deaf students were taught without the use of sign language, and more than half were so taught in at least some of their classes. The number of children taught entirely without sign language was nearly 80% by the end of the Great War, and oralism remained orthodox until the 1970s. Pupils who insisted on communicating with sign language were punished by placing their hands in thick gloves and then tying their hands together. Linguists who studied ASL showed it is a full-fledged language with grammar and syntax and puns and poems. Anything that can be said aloud can be said in ASL. And meaning is derived not just from hand shapes, but also from hand orientation, location, movement, facial expression. Some signers are not recognized as fluent because of herky-jerky movements. Other signers, it's like penmanship. If you could identify somebody's handwriting by looking at a page, it's entirely possible you could identify a deaf speaker simply by watching his or her hands, the movements that they make, the location that they take, because each individual has his or her own personality in sign language. Now, the debate about oralism versus manualism may remind you of the celebrity arguments between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla concerning direct current and alternating current for household electricity. In the case of teaching a language to the deaf, opposite opinions were expressed by Edward Minor Gallaudet, son of the man who set up the first American school for the deaf, who believed in a combination of oralism and manualism, and Alexander Graham Bell, who insisted that oralism was the only way that a human being should communicate. Manualism taught deaf people about the world. Oralism tried to teach deaf people how to be part of that world. Gallaudet and Bell were both sons of deaf mothers, and they shared many friends in their social circles. They were born a decade and an ocean apart. Gallaudet was born at his father's school in Connecticut in 1837. Bell was born in Scotland in 1847. Edward's father, the Reverend Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, had founded the American School for the Deaf, ASD, on April 15, 1817, in Hartford, Connecticut. It was originally called the American Asylum at Hartford for the Education and Instruction of the Deaf, the oldest permanent school for the deaf in the United States and the first school for deaf children anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Edward's mother, Thomas's wife, Sophia Fowler Gallaudet, was born deaf and she never tried to use her voice, but communicated freely with signs. Belle's mother was postlingually deaf. She used an ear trumpet. She taught her sons how to play the piano. Her speech and her language skills were superb. Belle's father and grandfather were both elocutionists. His family moved to Canada in 1870 and then to the United States the next year. Where the two men differed was in their beliefs of how language had much to do with the socialization of children and their eventual place in society. Gallaudet also saw language as essential to help the deaf understand Christianity. One of the teachers at Hartford described uninstructed deaf in animal-like terms. Quote, "Scarcely a ray of intellectual or moral light ever draws upon his solitude. His mind is a perfect blank. If he dies unblessed by education, he dies in this utter moral darkness. We must open the doors of his prison and let in upon him the light of truth." For manualists, the real calamity for the deaf-mute was, quote, "not that his ear is closed to the cheerful tones of the human voice, and it was, quote, not that all of the treasures of literature and science, of philosophy and history, are to him as though they were not. The calamity was the light of divine truth never shines upon his path. The crime, or the sin, was that uneducated deaf people were cut off from the Christian community and its message. The Christian community in turn saw the deaf as isolated from God. In other words, they were heathens. And these heathens lived and worked in the same communities as these fine, upstanding Christian proselytizers. However, in the rare instances where hearing and non-hearing did live and work together, both groups learned from and accepted the other. From the 16th to the 19th century, there was an unusually high rate of inherited deafness on Martha's Vineyard. This seemed to make no difference. The hearing people in these communities were all bilingual in English and a variation of British Sign Language. There were no clear differences in the social, economic, or political lives of the hearing and the deaf, and they could all communicate with each other. Bell came to have very pronounced views about how the oral method could integrate those with impaired hearing into the larger society, but did not have a place for those who could not use their voices and relied upon sign language. Bell was a believer in eugenics. He feared that intermarriage among the deaf would lead to, quote, formation of a deaf variety of the human race, end quote. Bell thought that enforcing laws which prohibited deaf partner marriages would be difficult. His solution? 1. Determine the causes that promote intermarriages among the deaf and the dumb. And 2. Remove them. The causes were simple. 1. They were in love. 2. They could communicate with each other. The eugenics preached by Bell had partially derived from work done by Laurel Hill East's Dr. Samuel George Morton, whom I talked about in All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 28, Bad Science. Because of eugenics, the deaf community suffered horribly under Nazi Germany. During the 1930s and 40s, more than 17,000 deaf Germans were sterilized. About 1,600 deaf people were exterminated by the Nazis, and of 600 known deaf people in pre-war Berlin, only 34 were alive at the end of the war. Teaching the deaf in Philadelphia began in 1819, when Jewish crockery maker David G. Sykes, 1788-1864, set up a school at his home to teach the impoverished deaf children he saw on the streets of Philadelphia. Soon he ran out of room, and his school grew into the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf, which is now recognized as the third oldest school of its kind in the United States. He next rented an office at the southeast corner of 11th and High Street, which now, of course, is Market Street, to serve as a school. In 1820, Sykes took in a street urchin named John Carlin, who soon became the first published deaf poet in the United States. In 1821, prominent Philadelphia citizens decided to help Sykes and incorporated a charitable society, the Pennsylvania Institution for the Deaf and Dumb. The number of deaf children who needed special education increased so much that a much larger school, more accurately an asylum, was soon needed. This became the stately Greek Revival structure that has stood at the northwest corner of Broad and Pine Streets for nearly 2 centuries, since 1826. This magnificent building is an excellent example of major works by 3 of America's most important 19th century architects, John Haviland, William Strickland, and Frank Furness. When the Pennsylvania School moved to a 70-acre campus in Philadelphia's Mount Airy neighborhood in 1892, the Broad and Pine building was bought by the predecessor of Philadelphia's University of the Arts. The structure, now known as Dorrance Hamilton Hall, is the oldest extant edifice on Broad Street. It is up for sale as I type this, after the surprise bankruptcy declaration by the University of the Arts earlier this year. All of their property is now for sale. The current school in Mount Airy is listed by the National Register of Historic Places, as are the 2 former campuses, similarly recognized. More than 30 schools for the deaf were established around the country. There are 4 in Pennsylvania. In the Deep South, schools for deaf were integrated by race, no surprise. This led to separate development of Black American Sign Language, or BASL, BASL. BASL tends to be more demonstrative than ASL. It uses far more two-handed gestures. And just as with verbal language, people who use BASL can code switch when they converse with users of standard ALS. Deaf communities started their own newspapers. The Deaf-Mute Times evolved into the Silent Worker. Silent News informed deaf Americans from 1969 to 2003. Many deaf people were assimilated into hearing society without too many problems. Shakespearean scholar Horace Howard Furness had developed deafness rather early in his life, which prevented him from becoming a lawyer. He instead became an expert on the bard. He is buried at Laurel Hill East. Many deaf young men were accomplished enough at baseball so that they played on major league teams. In fact, one of the greatest outfielders of 19th century baseball was William Ellsworth Hoy, 1862-1961. As you might expect, his teammates called him Dummy. Hoy spent 14 years playing with 8 teams in 4 different leagues, and despite the nickname, he was acknowledged as one of the smartest players of his era. On June 19, 1889, he set a Major League Baseball record, which has been tied twice since then, when he threw out 3 runners at home plate in one game. Who caught the ball and put the players out? Well, the catcher was a young guy named Connie Mack. It's because of Hoy that umpires developed their hand signs for strike, safe, and out, because Hoyt could not hear what they were saying. The 1901 New York Giants carried 3 deaf pitchers on their roster: George Michael Dummy Leitner, Luther Hayden Dummy Taylor, and William Joseph Dummy Deegan. At a game in 1902, Dummy Hoy batted against Dummy Taylor. It's the only known incident of a deaf pitcher in a showdown with a deaf hitter in a Major League Baseball game. The National Football League has also seen its share of deaf players. Bonnie Sloan of the 1973 Cardinals, Kenny Walker of the early 90s Broncos, Derek Coleman, 6 years with 4 teams in the NFL. In fact, football huddle was invented in 1892 at Gallaudet University, when the quarterback, Paul Hubbard, noticed that opposing teams could see the signs he was using to call the next play. So he gathered the players around him to prevent sign stealing, and it caught on. Deaf pro basketball? Well, recently there's Lance Allred. There was a barnstorming team of deaf players in the 1920s. They were called the Buffalo Silents. The Deaf Olympics have been in existence for a century, with their first competition in Paris in 1924. They predate and are separate from the Special Olympics. And starting pistols, bullhorn commands, referee whistles have all been replaced with visual cues. You may not have heard of the Deaf Olympics. They've only been in the United States twice, 1965 in Washington, D.C., and 1985 in Los Angeles. There are national and international deaf golf associations, deaf tennis associations, deaf bowling leagues, deaf wrestling teams. There is a Deaf Sports Hall of Fame. Other than sports, a large number of deaf men worked in the noisy press rooms of magazines and newspapers. The Washington Post employed 175 deaf typesetters and printers in the days when the newspaper was set by hand. There's actually a website called deafprinters.com that will give you more information about this history of deaf printers in the Washington Post. Deaf America exists as a parallel universe with Hearing America. You can attend Deaf Poetry Slam, a deaf stand-up comic, deaf plays. The National Theater of the Deaf has been around since 1967. The New York Deaf Theater since 1979. Deaf West Theater, 1991. Actor, bodybuilder Lou Ferrigno is about 80% deaf. He took up bodybuilding as a way to combat the teasing calls of dummy that he endured in school. Tony winner, three-time Emmy winner Nanette Fabray was also almost completely deaf, and she usually communicated using American Sign Language. Some large market television stations even have special language edition of the news. There are deaf scout troops. The Deaf Miss America pageant was born in the 1970s. More than a dozen newspapers are published specifically for the deaf community. In the 1960s, a telecommunication device for the deaf, TDD, allowed communication via a teleprinter, an electronic device for text communication over a telephone line. Other names for this device include teletypewriter, TTY, or text phone, which is common in Europe, or Minicom in the United Kingdom. The library at Gallaudet University, the only deaf liberal arts university in the United States, was founded in 1876. This library's collection has grown from a small number of reference books to the world's largest collection of deaf-related materials, more than 234,000 books and thousands of other materials in different formats. The collection is so large that the library had to create a hybrid classification system based on the Dewey Decimal Classification System to make cataloging and location within the library easier for both library staff and users. Most religious denominations have their own deaf services, including deaf synagogues. There's a Hebrew seminary for the deaf in Illinois. The Rainbow Alliance of the Deaf is one of several support groups for queer deaf people. And there's Pink Wings of Hope, an American breast cancer support group for deaf women. It was religious groups in America, in particular the Episcopalians, which took the deaf community as its special cause. Catholicism was a special case until the 1960s. That's when Vatican II allowed vernacular speech in the sacrament of the Mass rather than Latin, which had been used for centuries. Latin had completely shut out both oralists and manualists. The first culturally deaf Roman Catholic priest in the United States was not ordained until 1977. But Episcopalians led the way. They ordained their first deaf priest, the Reverend Henry Winter Syle, in Philadelphia in 1879. That's 98 years before the American Roman Catholics caught up and ordained a deaf Catholic priest. Reverend Syle is interred at Laurel Hill West in the Summit section. Henry Winter Syle was destined to become an Episcopalian minister. He was born in Shanghai, November 9th, 1846, to Reverend Edward W. Syle, an English clergyman who'd emigrated to America before he heard the call to go to China as one of the first English-speaking missionaries in that country. His mother, Jane M. Davis, was the daughter of the Reverend Henry Lyon Davis, president of St. John's College of Annapolis, Maryland. Henry's mother's brother and Henry's namesake was Henry Winter Davis, the driving force behind the abolition of slavery in Maryland in 1864, and the primary force that kept Maryland from seceding. Henry Davis turned down an opportunity to run as Abraham Lincoln's running mate in 1860 because he wasn't ready to turn Republican. Henry had a cousin named David Davis, who was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States and later a senator from Illinois. Henry showed an aptitude for learning. When he was only 3.5 years old, the ladies of the mission would send for him to read to them from the Bible. His parents sent him back to the United States when he was 4 years old for a healthier climate. His mother's aunt, Elizabeth Winter, took him in and became his surrogate mother. When she died, she left him a small sum to aid his studies. When Henry was 6 years old, he had a severe attack of scarlet fever, and it caused total paralysis of the auditory nerve and total deafness. For the rest of his life, he suffered from a feeble constitution and total loss of hearing, but his intellect thrived. In November 1853, at age 7, he entered the family school of David E. Bartlett in Fishkill, New York. He was so far in advance of the other children that Bartlett made him the special charge of his wife, who became warmly attached to him. Mrs. Bartlett later reported, "He had a mind that began early to investigate. For this purpose, he would look through all the books he could find on a given subject and surprise us by the knowledge which he had made his own. Soon after he was 8 years old and took to soldiering. He would tramp for hours over the place with his mimic cap and sword, going through imaginary evolutions and contriving, as he said, the best way of surprising an enemy." Henry readily learned hand signs to communicate with the other children. He preferred to get away by himself and read a good book, and he began to study Latin when he was 10. He recited orally until he was 12, but his speech grew more and more indistinct. Until he became sensitive to it, he just gave up speaking altogether. Now, he had begun memorizing poetry at an early age. He never lost that ability to memorize poems. When Mr. and Mrs. Bartlett and their family moved to Hartford, after he accepted a position at Gallaudet's school, Syle accompanied them and continued under the private tutelage of Mrs. Bartlett initially. He spent a lot of his spare time at the institution, though, and younger men looked up to him as a role model and an intellectual leader. He was fond of pottering around the institution's shops. He learned how to handle the tools of many trades. He was especially fond of carpentry. Amid the Civil War, in the fall of 1863, Henry entered Trinity College at Hartford on the advice of his father, who had returned to the United States. However, because of a disease in his eyes, he was forced to drop out the month that the war ended, April 1865. An extract from a letter from Professor Hart of Trinity shows the estimation in which he was held there. "He was in the class below my own. I knew him intimately. He was highly esteemed, both for his scholarship and for the worth of his character, by the officers and students of the college. I well remember the reputation which he had as a careful, graceful, and successful student, easily at the head of his class. And I find on looking over the college record that my memory is in accordance with the facts of the case. The average mark given him for his literary work in the freshman year was about 9/10 of the maximum." When Syle left Trinity, he went to Charleston, Virginia, where his father now lived, having remarried after his wife died. Young Syle was present at the inauguration of Dr. E.M. Gallaudet as president of the National Deaf-Mute College. Henry did not wish to be dependent on his father and applied for and secured the position of clerk at that institution. This allowed him much leisure, which he dedicated to studies. He wanted to enter the college as a student, but was dissuaded by the Reverend Dr. Thomas Gallaudet, who thought he was far too advanced to be much helped by the course there. Finally, he decided to go to England. He entered Cambridge University. The legacy that was left him by his great-aunt was sufficient to support him for 1 year. He hoped in that time to win a scholarship that would enable him to complete the course. He entered St. John's College and soon became a marked man among the students and professors. The distinguished mathematician, the Reverend Percival Frost, under whom he studied, was said to have shown him particular favor. He was successful in winning the scholarship for which he competed, but at the last moment it was claimed by one who had a prior right to which he had not previously cared to avail himself, and this was a bitter disappointment to Mr. Syle. He had exhausted his health and his purse, and he relinquished his university career and returned to the United States. March 1869, he was appointed a teacher at a Rome, New York school for the deaf, and he stayed there for 5 years. He was given charge of the highest grade of the grammar department. He was later made instructor in natural philosophy and chemistry to the high class. And when the collegiate department was inaugurated, he became a professor of those branches. Mr. Syle owned qualities that eminently fitted him for an instructor of the deaf. In addition to the remarkable power and activity of his mind, his ripe scholarship and vast fund of information, ever responsive to any demand he or others might make upon it, he had an unusually clear and full knowledge of the structure of the English language and understood from his long association with the deaf the difficulties they encounter in this study and how best to overcome them. Those who were his associates in the New York school testified of the high estimation in which he was held by both teachers and pupils. Mr. Fort Lewis Cellini, later a teacher at the Rome, New York school, wrote, "Those who associated with him will recall him with affection. Among an unprecedented array of deaf-mute and semi-mute teachers, he easily took the lead. He was a man of ideas, and improvement always followed where he was permitted to suggest. It is conceivable that a mind gifted as was this one, habitually at study and bent upon progress in all things, would in due time have given to the world results in the way of textbooks or otherwise of the highest value to the cause in which it was employed." June 1869, Mr. Syle, by consent of President Wolsey, was admitted to the examination at Yale College for the degree of Bachelor of Arts. This examination was purposely very thorough. It covered the whole 4 years course, and it lasted 3 weeks. Syle acquitted himself so well as to astonish and win the highest encomiums from the President. In 1872, he received the degree of Master of Arts from Yale and became the first deaf-mute to graduate from a hearing college in the United States. In 1886, Trinity claimed him as one of its alumni with the same degree, and while at the New York School, he pursued a brief course of study in the Columbia College School of Mines with a view to fitting himself for a profession of an assayer. 1872, Mr. Syle married Miss Margaret Flannery of Boston, who'd been one of his pupils in the New York School. She proved an able assistant in his later pastoral work and had 4 young children, all hearing. When he left the New York School, he opened a free night school for the deaf of that city under the auspices of the Board of Education. But that same year, in December 1874, he was offered and accepted a position at the United States Mint of Philadelphia, where his ability as an assayer and a mathematician gained for him rapid advancement. Mr. Syle had a deeply religious temperament. From boyhood, he was a diligent student of the Bible. When in York, he had charge of a Bible class connected with the Reverend Thomas Gallaudet's mission, And when he came to Philadelphia, he at once began active religious work among the deaf there. He was licensed as a lay reader and conducted regular Sunday services in the parish building of St. Stephen's Church. He began to study for holy orders, and on October 8, 1876, he was ordained a deacon of the Protestant Episcopal Church by the Right Reverend Bishop Stevens, who, in an eloquent and convincing sermon, upheld the validity of the sacraments as administered in the language of signs, and announced that, after long, careful study, he had arrived at the conclusion that nothing in the Bible or in the laws of church forbade the admission of deaf-mutes to the priesthood. This was in answer to those who opposed Mr. Syle's ordination as a violation of the principle that men who aspired to office in the church should be physically as well as morally sound and perfect, and because they believed that the sacraments of the Holy Communion of baptism would, if administered without the oral accompaniment of the proper words, be invalid and void. The bishop's decision was doubtless influenced by the able exposition of fallacy of those objections made by Mr. Syle himself, and it is therefore to him that deaf-mutes owe the opening to them this learned profession. Mr. Syle found that his duties in the mint interfered greatly with his religious work. He resigned his position there and devoted himself entirely to working with the deaf. On October 14, 1887, he was ordained as priest by Bishop Stevens, the first deaf man admitted to the office. Bishop Stevens celebrated this occurrence with a special sermon. Few things are more touching than to witness their silent worship and mark their eager faces as they drink in through the eye the varied truths as they fall, not from speaking lips, but from hands eloquent with expressive gesture, carrying straight to their souls the teachings of their divine Savior. It is beautiful to note how the law of compensation comes in to supplement and overmaster oral and lingual defects, and make more emphatic teaching by the hand and eye, and thus impart double quickness to the perceptive faculties. And, as in building the Temple of Solomon, there was no sound of any tool heard in the house while it was in building. So the living temples in the souls of these mutes are noiselessly built up by the Holy Ghost in the solemn silence of a speechless tongue and a closed ear. And in these living temples, the Lord is in truth present, and the earth does indeed keep silence before him. Reverend Syle now devoted all the vast energies of his mind widening and improving the work of the church mission to deaf. From Philadelphia he reached out until at the time of his death his field covered eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. On Sunday, May 1st, 1881, there was a religious service at St. James Church conducted in sign language by Reverend Henry Syle. Newspapers reported, Reverend Syle is a distinguished missionary of the church, regularly accredited as a missionary to the deaf-mutes of Philadelphia and neighboring dioceses. A very interesting feature of the service was the responses in their own language of the deaf-mutes, of whom 19 were present. Like services will be held at St. James from time to time, of which due notice will be given. Careful inquiries show that there are within 100 miles of Philadelphia from 1,500 to 2,000 deaf-mutes, of whom from 450 to 500 are in that city. It is the desire of Reverend Syle to obtain the name and address of every deaf-mute in the state. It was October 14, 1883, that Deacon Syle was ordained by Bishop Stevens at the Church of the Covenant on Filbert Street above 17th. The next day, St. Stephen's Protestant Episcopal Church on South 10th Street, Reverend Syle read a paper, The Preaching Adapted to Deaf-Mutes, which was later published as an article in the American Annals of the Deaf and Dumb in January 1884. In this sermon, Syle told his congregation, We may hope and believe that in almost all cases there is imparted to deaf children soon after they enter school a knowledge of God and of the Savior. But starting from so low a point and in so limited a time, it is evident that the religious instructions they are able to receive at school cannot be very extended. Yet the deaf have the same natural facilities of soul and spirit as their hearing relatives and their associates in their own rank of life, the same capacity for receiving and assimilating divine truth, the same temptations and trials, duties and joys, the same need, and the same Savior. Reverend Syle recognized that most deaf mutes were not blessed with the education he had received. Interestingly, he also warned against showboating. Of manner, comparatively little need to be said. It should be clear, earnest, and reverent. The preacher, impressed with the importance of his theme and remembering that he stands in the house of God as his messenger, will be free from the littleness of attempting to show off his own skill and elegance in sign-making. Especially will he be free of the exaggerated realism of pantomime that is in such danger of passing into vulgar buffoonery. At the same time, he will remember that all his pains in the preparation of his matter is thrown away if equal pains be not taken with its delivery. One great desire of his heart was gratified in 1888. He succeeded in securing a permanent home for his people in Philadelphia. For $9,000, he bought the building and lot of the Jewish congregation of Beth Emeth on Franklin Street above Green. After he spent a few $1,000s more, the building was repaired, altered to suit the needs of his work. And on December 8, 1888, it was formally consecrated by the Right Reverend Bishop Whitaker, successor to Bishop Stevens, under the name of All Souls Church for the Deaf, and Reverend Syle was installed as pastor. The fund for the purchase of the church was accumulated almost entirely through the exertions of Reverend Syle himself, and he came personally responsible for its maintenance. Reverend Syle did not confine himself to the religious instruction of the deaf. He also interested himself in their temporal fare, both as a class and individuals. The All Souls Working People's Club always found in him a wise counselor. The deaf of Philadelphia always relied upon him for advice and help in time of trouble. Those who lived in New Jersey and Delaware would travel long distances to consult him. He asked their creed, and his aid was as freely given to those opposed to his church as to his own parishioners, to those who reviled him as to those who were his warmest friends. His salary as missionary was not large, yet although he never boasted of his charities, it is known that a great part of it went to relieve cases of destitution. Often his benefits were rewarded with the basest ingratitude, but this never affected his actions, however much it wounded his feelings. He was almost sublime in the patience and charitableness with which he endured the many petty persecutions and annoyances to which he was subjected. Among those for whom he labored, there were a few capable of appreciating such a character, but it and his learning won for him the admiration and esteem of the highest dignitaries of the church in Philadelphia. And although he and his work seemed to attract little attention, the fact that the announcement of his death was posted on the bulletin board of almost every newspaper in the city, at a time when the mortality among prominent young men was unusually great, and that these papers contained in several instances, both in their news and their editorial columns, lengthy notices of his life, it shows that his progress was watched and noted by many. Syle was slightly built, pale-faced man, somewhat below the medium in height. He walked with a feeble, often tottering step. His face bore traces of constant suffering. There was a chronic inflammation of the tissues of his brain, which had often caused him excruciating torture, and which at one time so affected his mind that he was at his own request placed in a hospital for treatment. Even when these pains were at their worst, however, it was only necessary to broach a subject in which he was interested, and he would at once draw himself up out of the prostration they had occasioned and be at once alive with suggestions and arguments. He was a brilliant conversationalist when in the company of those who could appreciate him, and at such times there would flow from his fingers a sparkling stream of witticisms and humorous anecdotes which amused without wounding or shocking. He was always ready to listen to and avail himself of the suggestions of others, and was remarkably free for a man in his position from any suspicion of conceit or self-assertion. He was a clear and rapid, if not very graceful, sign-maker, and he had the facility of saying much in a few simple gestures. Reverend Henry Syle was the most devout and at the same time the most liberal of churchmen. He never thrust his religious views upon others, but was prompt to aid and encourage those who expressed a desire for better acquaintance with the tenets of his faith. It was to this that he owed much of his influence over those who differed from him in religious matters. His predominating characteristic was the minuteness and perfection with which he did everything he undertook. He gave his personal attention to every detail of his religious and secular work in Philadelphia. This was carried to such an extreme as to become almost a fault. Those who would willingly have relieved him of part of his onerous duties found that he would spend more time reviewing their work than it would originally have taken him to do it himself. Reverend Syle's abilities as a writer are shown by his many contributions to the Annals and his article on deaf mutes in Appleton's Encyclopedia. He was also something of a versifier. He occasionally contributed hymns to the religious newspapers. The many societies for the advancement of the deaf with which he was connected speak for him as an organizer. The decorations of his church, which are entirely planned by himself, show his aesthetic taste. Endless anecdotes could be told to show the wide range and diversity of his learning. He was one of the most remarkable deaf men the world has yet known, and not the least remarkable thing in his career was the fact that the higher he rose above those with whom fate had shown him, the lower he stooped to reach and succor them. Reverend Henry Winter Syle died from pneumonia in 1890 at age 43 years. His final resting place at Laurel Hill West is in the shadow of the massive Betz mausoleum in the Summit section. I include him on the tour that I give of the Summit section. In 1913, All Souls Episcopal Church at 16th and Allegheny was consecrated by Bishop Thomas J. Garland. This church had been built at a cost of $40,000 and was commemorated in the name of the Reverend Henry Syle, who had served as rector for many years. The newspaper articles that reported this consecration made note of the choir, with choir in quotation marks. The leader, who is neither deaf nor dumb, intoned the words, "Thy temple is not made with hands," spelling the same words with her fingers in the sign language. The choristers then joined in with her, keeping time with their fingers. There was no music. You were watching music. Reverend Henry Syle's work was so important to the church that he's recognized as a saint on the Episcopalian calendar. He shares the feast day of August 26th with Thomas Gallaudet. They're tucked between Louis, King of France, on August 25th, and Augustine of Hippo on the 28th. His work among the deaf was immeasurable. I'm going to finish with sections of a 1971 poem by a deaf poet, Willard J. Madsen. What is it like to hear a hand? You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to be a small child in a school, in a room void of sound, with a teacher who talks and talks and talks, and then when she does come around to you, she expects you to know what she's said. You have to be deaf to understand. Or the teacher thinks that to make you smart, you must first learn how to talk with your voice. So mumbo-jumbo with hand on your face for hours and hours without patience or end, until it comes out a faint resembling sound. You have to be deaf to understand. There are 7 more similar verses that follow before this finish. What is it like to comprehend some nimble fingers that paint the scene with the spoken word of the moving hand, that makes you part of the world at large? You have to be deaf to understand. What is it like to hear a hand? You have to be deaf to understand. I certainly hope you learned as much as I did when I was preparing for this podcast. The bibliography on this is a monster. Okay? You can turn it off now if you don't want to hear the bibliography. But I'm just giving you a brief set of papers that I used in one book. And I'm just going to let it go at that, because there were probably more that I used. Well, there were a lot of newspaper articles that I used. I'm not even going to tell you about them. The first article is by Henry Winter Syle, The Preaching Adapted to Deaf Mutes. It's from the American Annals of the Deaf and Dumb, January 1884, volume 29, number 1, pages 24 to 30. Biographical sketch on Henry Winter Syle, from the American Annals of the Deaf, volume 35, number 2, from April of 1890. The Education of the Deaf Child for Integration or Autonomy. Source on that, American Annals of the Deaf. The author is Paul Arnold. February 1984, volume 129, number 1, pages 29 to 37. Author Barry A. Crouch. Gallaudet, Bell, and the Sign Language Controversy. The source is Sign Language Studies, spring of 1989, number 62, pages 71 to 80. Douglas C. Bainton, from American Quarterly, June of 1922, volume 44, number 2. A Silent Exile on This Earth, the Metaphorical Construction of Deafness in the 19th Century. That's a big one. That's 206 pages 216 to 243. But a lot of good stuff in there. A lot of good stuff. From non-scholastic literature, I've got Deafness as Culture by Edward Dolnick, The Atlantic Monthly, September 1993, pages 37 through 53. Article by Harry G. Lang, Genesis of a Community, The American Deaf Experience in the 17th and 18th Centuries. That's from the Deaf History Reader. Editor, John Vickery Van Cleve, 2007. This is Chapter 1. This is pages 1 through 19. Jamie, Jaymie, Bianca, The Evolution of Deaf Education in the United States, a historical analysis with recommendations for enhancing deaf education in the future. That is from the Trinity College Digital Repository. That was a senior thesis that was submitted in May of 2021. And as I say, there were several newspaper articles that I used also, especially the descriptions of the services that were conducted by Reverend Syle. There's one book that I want to recommend just for general information about deafness. The copy that I picked up was copyright 1981, but I've got the 5th printing, which was 1992. It's called Deaf Heritage, A Narrative History of Deaf America. It's by Jack R. Gannon, published by the National Association of the Deaf. It is a terrific read. I enjoyed reading this book so much. It's like I'm reading about this, as I mentioned in the podcast, this parallel civilization that is living right beside what I, a hearing person, consider the normal universe, and yet there is a totally separate existing universe where people cannot hear. It is absolutely fascinating read. I highly recommend it. Lots and lots of research articles. Oh my Lord, there were so many things I read for this. Hope you enjoyed this. I had a lot of fun doing it. It was a lot of work, but I think it was worth it. And I'll see you next time. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground.